Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Science Cafe. Are y'all having a good Thursday so far? Okay, good. Don't scare me like that, hesitating. Welcome, everybody, to the Museum of Natural Sciences. My name is Chris. I'm your host for the Science Cafe every Thursday night. We're right here in the Daily Planet Cafe, learning about what's going on in the world of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and how those things apply to our daily lives. Science, of course, is all around us, everywhere you look. It's in your daily life. It's even in the books that you read. So that means there's a commercial coming. If you haven't already, I would suggest that everyone check out this little bookmark that's on your table. It's for a special event that's being hosted in support of the museum. Authors John Grisham and John Hart are coming to May Mandy Concert Hall on February 23rd to have a conversation about writing, creativity, imagination in the service of writing their books, of course, which are works of fiction. But proceeds from this event are going to support the works of fact that we do right here at the museum. And of course, you'll also hear at that event from one of our research scientists, our paleontologist, Lindsay Zano, who's going to talk about using imagination and creativity to tell the stories of fact and how we know what happened way back when compared to how these fellas invent the stories that they do. So I hope that you'll join us for Thrillers on February 23rd. It promises to be a really cool evening. There are VIP tickets that are still on sale, so if you want to meet them and enjoy a reception with some of the really fancy people here at the museum, which I know you want to do, make sure you check out this event. It's going to be fun. I hope to see you there. Tonight for the Science Cafe, we're going to be talking about the science of the small, the very, very small, nanotechnology. We had a speaker, I guess it was more than a year ago, we had someone come in and chat with us about nanotech, and I remember learning some incredible things that this technology can do. So we're going to try to one-up it, and we've got Mark Wisner from Duke University. He's also with the National Science Foundation's Center for the Environmental Implications of Nanotechnology. So what I'm gathering from this, and what I gathered from the description that he provided us, is that nanotechnology might not always be good, or maybe we need to think about what using nanotechnology will mean for us in the future. We've got the science. We're learning how it works. What can it mean for the way nanotech is going to work for us in the future? Put your hands together and welcome to the stage Dr. Mark Wisner.
Thanks, Chris. Well, this is my first Science Cafe here, and so I gather that this is not the first Science Cafe for many of you. So thanks for welcoming me here. So I'm gonna, yes, as we talked about, we're gonna be on the topic of small things tonight, nanotechnology, and more specifically, we're gonna be talking about nanomaterials. So when you think about materials, materials are really central to our society. Okay, they're the basis of the buildings that we build, whether they be stone or steel. They're the way that we play music, for example. I'm a bass player, so art and the materials that we use to make instruments, it's an important thing. It's important in the way we generate electricity, whether it be wood to make a water wheel or silicon to make solar panels. Materials are important in the way we dress, and they're important in the way that we provide water, for example. So, you know, whether it's a stone aqueduct or polymers that are used to make membranes in water treatment, which is more my specialty. So you can see a lot of things at the industrial scale, but if you go out and just look at the shelves of your local drugstore, you'll probably find a lot of things as well. You'll find nanomaterials that are present in personal care products, you know, cosmetics, sunscreens, things like this. You'll find nanomaterials in your cell phone. You'll find nanomaterials in sporting goods. they've really permeated the market to a very large degree. And so with all of the use of these nanomaterials showing up in products, the question is posed as to not only how do we derive the best benefit from it, but also what are the possible implications of these materials for human health and the environment. The thing about nano is that you're taking materials. Think about, for example, gold. If you had a block of gold and you subdivided it in half, you'd be half as rich. But you'd also have a smaller block of gold that you could keep subdividing until it's smaller and smaller. And we put gold, for example, in fillings, and one of the reasons that gold is so interesting is that it's supposedly inert, right? And it turns out when you get down to the nanometric scale, gold actually becomes a catalyst. Reactions occur on the surface of the gold. And so it's almost as though you were to take the periodic table and build another dimension out for each one of the elements into that of size. Okay, so we talk about nanomaterials. What is a nanomaterial? I mean, one definition is that it's anything between 1 and 100 nanometers that has novel properties. In fact, the definition really depends on which country you go to, and the European Union has been trying to come up with a definition for the last 15 years. It's a sticky issue, and we'll get back to regulation a little bit later. But here's another example. The images that you see here are all the same material. These are quantum dots. It's made out of, in this case, basically a cadmium-based material. And the only thing that changes is the size. And because the size changes, the wavelength of light that fluoresces off of this material changes. Okay, so the color changes with size. So size, as I said, you can think of it kind of as another dimension of the periodic table. And if their properties change with size, then you can think about, well, how can we use those changes to do things like bioimagery using materials like these quantum dots? Or you might also ask the question, are there different impacts on health and the environment with things that we normally thought were just benign, like gold? Is it something that maybe has some other properties when it gets small? So when I say small, how small are we talking about here? So here's the comparison of the big thing that you see there in that film is a hair, one strand of hair, and there's a nanofiber next to that. Okay, so to give you a sense, if you were in space looking down from the International Space Station on the United States, and you looked coast to coast, okay, and that represented a meter. Okay, a nanometer would be 1 grain of rice sitting there in the United States. So it's small, and the work that we do is not only in making materials at that scale, but also the really challenging one is being able to detect it in very complex media. Okay, things like tissues and background environmental media and so on. The poster child for the nanoparticle, and one of the things that kicked off in the United States here around 2000, the National Nanotechnology Initiative, was the discovery of this molecule here. It's this soccer ball shaped molecule that's referred to as a Buckminster fullerene. It was discovered by 3 people. 2 of them were actually colleagues of mine when I was at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Rick Smalley, and he was actually the person present in the Oval Office when the National Nanotechnology Initiative was signed. So him and Robert Curl are both professors there at Rice, and before their discovery, they had the sense was that carbon was only present in certain forms that we call allotropes. So, one allotrope of carbon are diamonds, another one would be graphite, and this was a whole new form of carbon that wasn't known before they discovered it. And it turns out there's all sorts of variations on this material. Once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. You see it in meteorites, you see it in geologic deposits. So it's not only something that we can make, and usually it's made via combustion, but there's other ways you can make this material. It forms under these conditions of combustion in nature as well as in the laboratory and in factories. As I said, it's called Buckminster Fullerene, as you can imagine. It was inspired by the geodesic domes of the architect Buckminster Fuller. So my interest in nanotechnology began with, I showed you a picture of polymer-based membranes, and I mentioned that I do water treatment. So my interest was, can we make new kinds of membranes for treating water using nanomaterials? And we had a lot of success making, we were starting with what's called an alamoxane nanoparticle and making ceramic membranes that you could use for filtering water, and it turns out some of these membranes are also very interesting in fuel cells for producing electricity and so on. Here's some pictures of some membranes that we use. These are polymeric membranes where we put in carbon nanotubes. Carbon nanotubes are the buckyball that I showed you a moment ago, that soccer ball shaped molecule. If you imagine that same sort of cage structure opened up as a tube, that's a carbon nanotube. And this material is very, very interesting. It's about 100 times stronger than steel and 10 times more conductive than copper. So a lot of very interesting applications for this. And one of the applications we wanted to look at was, if we make membranes for treating water or removing contaminants from polluted water, sometimes one of the problems that you run into is that the membranes will actually break, and this barrier that you have in trying to filter things out is compromised. So maybe we could add something to the polymer to make it even stronger, to make maybe the membrane even thinner so that you don't need as much energy to drive water across the membrane, and so on. So I describe it as nano rebar. Okay, it's as though you're putting some polymer down and you reinforce it with these carbon nanotubes that really make it much stronger. Another application of nanomaterials is if you have a contaminated site. So actually, I just went to the dentist today and was hearing some terrible things about the polluted water. My dental hygienist grew up at Fort Bragg, and there's all sorts of issues with it's a cancer cluster, a lot of terrible things going on there. It has to do with the polluted water that resulted from putting solvents and a whole host of terrible mixture of materials from Agent. I don't know if they have Agent Orange there. I did some work at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. There they had Agent Orange, Agent Purple. They had TCE, a whole host of things. Fort Bragg, I'm not sure what they had there, but it was bad, and it's in the groundwater. And this happens in a lot of places. And so we have Superfund sites that we want to clean up. And one problem with cleaning up a Superfund site is it's very expensive. You often have to keep pumping the water almost for eternity because the stuff stays down there forever. Or you have to excavate everything out. So an alternative would be to pump something down into the ground that would basically destroy the contaminant in place. Sometimes we use bacteria that can naturally degrade this, but we can give them some help or just do it independently by pumping basically electrons down into the ground in the form of iron particles. These iron particles give off electrons, and they can help degrade the materials. And the way to get that stuff down and to get it to diffuse out is to put it as a suspension of iron nanoparticles that have this ability to diffuse throughout the groundwater system. And so, yeah, I was warned you were going to do that to me. If I'm not loud enough, I have to act like a rock star here. So my wife, on the other hand, told me I shouldn't hurl or shouldn't scream too much into this thing. Anyway, what you see here in this picture is a vat of some of these nanoparticles of iron that are being used to pump down into contaminated groundwater sites, and you can do groundwater remediation with that material. Another idea is to use nanomaterials to do disinfection or to do some medical applications. In this case, we were looking at those buckyballs that I showed you. This is a variation on the buckyballs. They've been what we call hydroxylated. They have OH groups sitting out on the surface. And those buckyballs, when they come in contact with a virus and then you shine light on it, they begin to basically produce a disinfectant that we refer to as singlet oxygen. So it can actually kill viruses. And you can imagine coming up with ways where instead of throwing chlorine into the water, where you throw a lot of chlorine in and you hope that some of the chlorine gets to the bacteria and the viruses, you throw in particles that basically target the stuff that you're trying to kill. So there's all sorts of, these are just a few examples of things that we've done in trying to think about in protecting public health and protecting or remediating the environment. So why don't we just go ahead and go full steam in using these materials? And as I was making these membranes back in the late 90s, the thought occurred to me that maybe we should be thinking more, or in addition to how we can use them, in terms of what the possible environmental implications might be of these materials. Because we've been down this road before. Okay, if it's DDT, that actually the Nobel Prize was awarded in the 30s for the discovery of DDT, and it's actually kind of been resurrected in terms of it's not entirely a bad actor these days. The Nobel Prize was awarded because of the wonders that it was going to do in public health and eradicating malaria, right? But it gets used a lot, more and more. We discovered that there were problems, very subtle issues that had to work their way through the environment. In this case, it created eggs that the shells were much softer, and so you had species like the bald eagle that were not able to reproduce. You can think of all sorts of examples. Asbestos, okay, I think that was how we advertised this. So asbestos is great stuff. I mean, it stops things from burning, right? But then we discovered there's some issues with asbestos. Freon, okay, freon's not toxic. Why should we worry about freon? Well, it gets up into the atmosphere and it has problems with degrading the ozone hole. So the question is, are nanomaterials emerging contaminants? And that was really the whole research effort that I launched back around 2000. And over the years, when I came here, I moved to the Triangle area and Duke University in 2006. And in 2008, we got a grant from the National Science Foundation, and the EPA at that time was participating in it as well. And it really created an international team, but particularly based here in the United States, a number of institutions in addition to Duke, but with a lot of international partners working on this issue of the environmental implications of nanotechnology. There's a lot of different ways that you can approach this question. I mean, there's some pretty highfalutin science that you can throw at this, so-called high throughput screening, where you try to reduce the world to a few microliters, and you have hundreds of vials that are automatically analyzed in some of the equipment that we have. And then you produce lots and lots of data, and then you give it machine learning sorts of techniques to try to make sense of what's going on. The problem with that is you kind of, it's like how you can change the context of a picture by just cropping it differently, right? And so what if you cropped everything wrong? What if you're not looking at the whole picture? Okay, you might have lost your keys, and you start looking, you say, well, it's, I probably left it in the pocket, you know, of my coat, or maybe I left it over there on this table. And you can go through all that, but you go through all the possibilities, and there's something that maybe you forgot to think about, right? So this is the point with these high throughput screening models, is that there's really no substitute for reality. So in our work, we also do things. We have what you see in the upper left-hand corner here is a picture of the Duke mesocosm facility. It's a facility out in the Duke forest that simulates a freshwater wetland, and we can drop nanomaterials into these boxes that you see there, and then really monitor where they go, how long it takes for them to get there, and the organisms that it impacts along the way. It's a multi-scale sort of research effort, so we're working at the scale of these mesocosms. We use some equipment like this synchrotron here, which is basically a high energy light source that allows us to probe things down at the molecular and atomic scale. We do things more at the scale of conventional microscopy. You see some pictures there of a worm, a kind of worm we call C. elegans, which has actually, the nanoparticles have been transferred from the mother into what you see there are the egg sacs. And we've got some things like hyperspectral imaging, where you can stare down. This was actually developed by the military initially. You could stare down from space onto a battlefield, and based on the kind of light that was being reflected, you could differentiate between, say, a tank and a soldier. Well, we can do the same thing looking down on a microscopic image and tell what kinds of particles we're looking at, and which ones are nanoparticles and which ones are other materials. As we've looked at this, we've learned a lot. So we've learned that nanomaterials can be taken up by many organisms, and they can also do what we call either, there's trophic transfer. They can move from one level, say bacteria that are eaten by the worms that I just showed you, or plants can take these up and they can be eaten by caterpillars, or bacteria can be eaten by worms, which can be eaten by frogs, and so on. So we know that these things can be bioavailable, and we know that they can actually be transferred through these various trophic levels. And this is a little bit surprising. We were presenting our results one time at Duke, and actually the former dean of the School of Environment there at Duke, a very distinguished ecologist. He was on our advisory board. He's now at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies, which has nothing to do with Cary here. It's up in New York. But he looked at our results, and he saw this image here. This is a plant, and the red or gold sort of image you see there are gold nanoparticles that were taken up by the plant and distributed through the leaves. And he made this statement: in your typical plant biology course, you don't learn that metals are taken up by plants in the form of particles. We usually think about these things as being dissolved and going up through the roots. And we've learned, and maybe we should be surprised that we were surprised, but we've learned that these particles actually are available to plants. The plants use them. Other organisms use particles. In fact, particles are probably important in the way that things like bacterial colonies communicate with one another. Life has evolved around and is composed of nanoscale objects. So it's really a part of everything around us. And when you think about nanomaterials as a potential contaminant, you have to ask yourself, well, how big a problem is this really? Compared with what? So when you start looking at the masses of engineered nanomaterials that we produce, and you compare that with, say, nanomaterials that are coming out of your smokestack or out of the tailpipe of your car, well, there's a lot more of that. And when you compare that with what's actually naturally occurring, small bits of clay and so on, the natural sources more than outweigh that. So we shouldn't be surprised that life uses nanoscale objects. Things are transported around, and they're actually just a part of our natural ecology. The question is are these new engineered nanoparticles, do they have different properties than the natural occurring materials? And now that we have the tools to look at things at the nanoscale, we can also look at other kinds of pollutant and the nanoscale, the things that are formed, and we can also see how the natural and everything else, how it carries around other kinds of contaminants that might want to piggyback a ride on them, right? So what else have we learned? Well, we've really learned that for most of the materials, the nanomaterials that are toxic, people consider toxic, well, they're not that toxic. Now, believe me, it would have been very beneficial to our research program if we'd found lots of toxicity of these nanomaterials. I mean, the money would have rolled in for more research grants. But it's a good thing for society that with all the applications that I showed you, that for most of the nanomaterials that we're using, that the toxicity is quite small. So this, you don't need to look too much at this table here and get into the details. But what's shown here are different materials in the left-hand column, and in the right-hand column is what we call the LD50. It's the dose of this material that will kill 50% of, in this case, rats and mice that are given this material orally. And what I want you to really, what's in red there is carbon nanotubes. I'm having a hard time seeing it from here. Carbon nanotubes, nano silver, and nano titanium dioxide. And these all have doses of greater than 2,000, okay, to kill half of the rats and the mice. And that's compared with salt, sodium chloride, which is 3,000. Or if you go the other direction, atrazine. Atrazine's not such great stuff. Go down a little bit further. Aspirin. Aspirin is actually considered to be more toxic than atrazine in the context of lethal dose. We could talk about the chronic effects. That's kind of another issue. So in terms of what will kill you immediately, these materials are not particularly toxic. But you might ask the question, well, what will kill you in the long term? So then there's things like endocrine disruptors, things that will have you grow, a third limb, or have more subtle effects that associated with long-term chronic dosage. And there have been effects observed from nanomaterials on that, but when you really dig into the literature, what you find out is that where there have been effects, there have been at least one of three things that have occurred. One, they were dosed in really ridiculously high concentrations. So the nanomaterials, in some cases, literally just smothered the cell cultures. The second case is that they were using cell cultures and not whole organisms. And organisms actually have ways that have been evolved for dealing with some of these materials. And then the third and most important one is that, and this is my take-home message to you, which nanomaterials are toxic? Well, if you make a nanomaterial out of something toxic, it will be toxic. So I advise you to avoid plutonium nanoparticles. There's a very common ingredient in sunscreens now. For example, it's a titanium dioxide or sometimes a zinc oxide nanoparticle, and it has a coat around it to sort of protect the particle, and also it's a rather complicated object that allows you to put it in creams and so on. I would much rather have that in my sunscreen than have something like parabenzoic acid, which is also actually not that bad. I mean, but we do know that it has known toxic effects that are considerably more toxic than the titanium dioxide that's there. And in either case, I'd rather have the parabenzoic acid than expose myself to the risk of melanoma. So, we need, there are risks, but we need to put all these things into perspective. Well, so what have we done? We've learned that nanomaterials are really important in living systems. We've learned that if you make a nanoparticle out of something that we knew was toxic, and it's not just things like cadmium or plutonium, but also carbon nanotubes. We do know that if they're the right size, they will be light. They will have aspects that are very similar to asbestos. We knew that. We knew that from fiber inhalation studies. And so it could be carbon nanotubes, but it could be silica fibers, it could be asbestos, and so on. So is it the next asbestos? Well, probably not, and you can't really generalize to it, but I could find you some cases where it might act like asbestos. So we've come to the conclusion that many of these materials are relatively safe. And again, nothing is entirely safe, so we need to trade off the risks with the benefits. Should we have done this work? Okay, we did all this work, we spent a lot of money, was it worth it? And I claim absolutely, because first of all, to derive the benefits of these materials, there's a lot of doubt about investing in new technologies when they come along, and that doubt is what we need to address in doing research like this. It really oils the wheels of innovation when you have a clear, lucid view of what the possible risks are associated with any new technology. And this is really a test case. This is the first time that I know of that the scientific community was there at the starting gate saying, okay, it's not on the market yet. Let's think about this, and let's evaluate the risk. My claim would be that we should do this consistently for all new technologies. And sometimes, hopefully, they're going to come up safe, and sometimes they're not. But it should be just part of our natural reflex to do this for all new technologies. Despite some of the data that I've shown you, there are those that feel that there is something universally bad about small things. And you get into the difference between the precautionary principle, as some people refer to it, and risk-based decision-making. So what's the difference? In the United States, we tend to do risk-based decision-making on whether or not things should be on the market. And it's a generalization, but many European countries are more on the precautionary principle. To summarize it, it's basically the United States would have the philosophy, and again, I'm really generalizing here, but no data, no regulation. And in Europe, it would be no data, no market. And so we have regulations that are being put in place for new materials, new chemicals. It's called the REACH legislation in Europe. And nanomaterials are going to be part of that, where you're going to have to show the safety of the materials before it can come on the market. If this really takes on the dimensions that it could take on, you might hear some talk about, in political circles, about Europeans maybe throwing up barriers to trade based on the idea of nanomaterials being present in products, because they're present in a lot of products. We saw the same thing, you might recall, from biotechnology, and people like to draw parallels between biotechnology and nanotechnology. There are some parallels, but I'd say the biotechnology issue and genetically modified organisms, which have, it seems to me to be a more credible reason to put up a trade barrier, because some people just are more concerned about what they're eating in their food, and there are, I think we now know, some concerns about genetic materials getting out in the environment. That's another talk. But what I'll leave you with is this idea that we really need to have a discussion about how we do proactive research, whether it's about biotechnology, genetically modified organisms, whether it's nanotechnology. When we create a new technology, what are the resources that we set aside for doing this sort of proactive research? And also recognizing that it's not just kind of money that takes away from the innovation and the new technologies. What we have learned about nanoparticle movement and its interaction with plants, we're now looking at applications for improving agriculture, being able to see how particles which are taken up by plants and can be targeted to specific surfaces, how those might be used to target the delivery of nutrients, of fertilizers, or to target the delivery of pesticides, so that you use less of these materials and achieve the desired result. So hopefully, I've said a few things that will provoke some discussion here, and so let's get on with it here.
Thank you very much. Let's get on with the discussion. If you have questions, raise your hand. I already see a couple going up. And Katie and I will bring microphones around. That way everybody in the room can hear. And we'll try to get to as many of you as we can.
Hi. Very worthwhile. Going back to the early part of your talk, one of the things that you said is that in many cases nano scale materials have very different characteristics from the larger ones. And I'm sure that for different materials, the reasons for that are different. But I'm wondering if you can give us some of the most important reasons why these characteristics are different at smaller scale.
Yeah, well, yeah, they are different for different things. So The example that I showed you of the different colored suspensions there, that comes from an effect that we call quantum confinement. And so, again, to kind of reduce it to the simplest terms, it's the idea that electrons, when they're excited by photons, they're going to, when the object becomes small enough, they're going to move differently, and so they'll be able to fluoresce differently. And so you confine it, the object that those electrons have to move around in becomes smaller and smaller, and so it fluoresces with a different property. There are properties of what we call reactive oxygen species generation. Okay, so many of the properties of nanomaterials actually stem. Let me in fact focus on this. The most important one is the fact that these are all surface. If you get down to something really, really small, the amount of atoms that make up the object, well, once it's small enough, they're all on the surface, or almost all. Okay, and atoms on surfaces of objects behave differently than atoms in the bulk of the object. Okay, so if you think about a piece of sand, silica dioxide, within the silica dioxide, all of the silicas have to be connected to two oxides, and there's a lattice structure there, and it's perfectly happy within that bulk object. But when you get out to the surface, all of a sudden there's an oxygen looking for a silica, or a silica looking for an oxygen, and it's not there, it's out on the surface. And so things happen on the surface that are different. So when you reduce the object to something that's really, really small, all of a sudden you have lots of those surface phenomena. And those surface phenomena might not have been relatively important in a larger object, but they're the whole thing when you get down to the nanoscale.
Conductivity.
So what accounts for the conductivity, the high electrical conductivity of carbon nanotubes? No, that's a bit different. That has to do with the alignment of the carbon molecules along the axis of the carbon nanotube. There's other materials, graphene, which have very similar properties, and it's really it's not so much being small; it's the configuration of the individual atoms in that case that do it. Thank you.
In the back here.
Hi.
So you mentioned a pretty sizable number of really interesting use cases for nanostructures and nanotechnology. Are there any use cases that you individually are most excited about? I'd love to hear one or two examples.
Well, I think the biggest one that I think is one of the biggest challenges that we have in our society today is energy storage. I mean, it's all about those batteries that are burning on the airplane. But so it's not always going well, but that's where we have to go. And I think to take advantage of solar energy, to take advantage of wind energy, we need the storage. That's the thing that's going to make it work. And so, and nanotechnology is going to be huge for that. The other one that's associated with energy is transmission. So if we go back to these carbon nanotubes that have really high conductivity, I know one of Rick Smalley's visions was to have transmission lines. You could transmit electricity with with less loss. I think we lose something like 15% of the energy generated just in the transmission line. So if you could lose, it might be more actually, don't quote me on that, but there's important losses. And so if you could generate, the extreme would be you generate solar power on the sunny side of the planet and be able to send it over to the dark side at night, and vice versa, right? So, yeah.
We've got one over there.
Yeah, great presentation. So
thanks.
when you were speaking earlier about some of the analogs and the analogies that you might draw, and you're talking about DDT, for example, some of the really bad outcomes come when stuff like this gets concentrated as it moves up through the food web.
Right.
Mercury, for example, not so bad in tiny quantities, very bad in tuna.
Right.
Are there any examples or concerns about that kind of thing with nanotechnologies that you could talk about?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't seen it. So I didn't really get into this, but one of the reasons that we were running these mesocosms is for exactly as I said, you'd never get to the ozone hole by looking at the toxicity of Freon, right? So there could be much more complex interactions. Some of them might have to do with trophic transfer and bioaccumulation, biomagnification, but these interactions would not be obvious by looking in a test tube and seeing how many organisms you can kill. And so we wanted to do these studies with active ecosystems where there was numerous trophic chains and water compartments, terrestrial compartments, different kinds of plants, the variability that occurs in the environment, real systems. They're as close to real as we could get without really throwing this stuff out there. By the way, the Canadians did an experiment where they threw a bunch of nanosilver out into one of their lakes. So that's a big mesocosm. What we've observed in doing those experiments are some really very interesting and sometimes subtle effects. So we just, for example, we finished one experiment where we threw in nano copper, and copper is often used as a biocidal agent. So we were expecting to kill some stuff. We threw in some other nanomaterials, but I really wanted to have nano gold in there. I really wanted nano gold in there because I thought, well, everything we know about the gold, despite what I told you about it being a catalyst when it gets small, it's actually pretty inert, and it's going to cycle through the system, and we'll be able to use the gold like a tracer to see how fast it moves through these ecosystems. And we actually in some of our mesocosms we put in extra fertilizer to sort of put the pedal to the metal and make it move a little bit faster. And in others it was just not accelerated in terms of its growth rates and so on. Well, what we observed was that the one that had the biggest effect was a nano gold. So my hypothesis would appear to be wrong. Actually, what happened is that the gold is it loves to absorb phosphorus. That was the fertilizer we were adding, or one of the things we were adding. So the phosphorus absorbs, and then it goes into the plants, and the plants can pick it up, and it accelerates. And so we saw more acceleration of more impact from the gold than the stuff that was supposed to kill things on the other hand. So.
Up here?
Yeah.
I have a question. Sorry. Just going back to that chart where you're talking about the LD50, the lethal doses. It appeared like most of those were ingested materials.
Yes.
So I was just wondering, has there been any research done, or did that include respiratory or inhalation issues?
Right. So you can look at all sorts of different studies. So I picked those as an example. But yes, the things that we know about carbon nanotubes were done from inhalation studies, or done with studies of you can actually create models of the lung using different cells. So so inhalation studies are done. Dermal studies, right? So actually some very interesting, one of my colleagues here at North Carolina State, Nancy Monteiro Rivera, she's not here anymore, but she was one of the early people using pigskin as a model for looking at how nanomaterials might penetrate the skin and so on, which of course, as you can imagine, is a big issue with the sunscreens and so on. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for the talk.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of a hot topic in the news these days is artificial intelligence, and players, futurists and thinkers like Elon Musk and others are warning us of issues of existential risk. And one of the mechanisms that they discuss is a way that we could be unwittingly affected is through nanomaterials. And so I was wondering if you could talk about sort of the idea of existential risk as far as are nanomaterials really as dangerous in a global sense as these people are wanting us to think?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that I can speak properly to existential risk. I mean, I can speak directly to quantifiable risk, and the risk that we've looked at is at a couple different levels. So as I'd mentioned, we do studies in the center looking at direct acute risk associated with exposure to nanomaterials. We do studies looking at chronic exposure and developmental issues that occur with exposure to nanomaterials. So we expose, for example, fish eggs, which you know, it's the early developmental stages often when you put in a contaminant, not particularly nanomaterials, but just contaminants in general, that you'll see some perturbation early in the life of the organism that sort of gets multiplied as the organism gets older. So we've looked at those sorts of things. And then we've looked at the idea that maybe there are more complex interactions that occur between organisms and things that might occur at a geochemical scale within wetlands or lakes and so on. So those are the kinds of risks that we've looked at. And again, I think my take-home message would be that there are, in all those cases, risks associated with materials that are toxic. But we haven't really seen anything that I would describe as just uniformly because it's nano, because it's small. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Is that? Okay, thank you. Yes?
My question moves a little away from the biological. You mentioned catalysis earlier. In certain reaction examples, like using platinum in catalytic converters, are there advantages for those processes to go nano, and has that been explored much?
Yeah, it has, and your catalytic converter is a great example. There's nano in there. Or another great example having to do with just internal combustion engines is nanoserium dioxide. So this is an additive that's commercially available in some parts of Europe. You pour it into the tank of your diesel vehicle, and what it does is well, let me back up. You often have cerium dioxide on the surface of your self-cleaning oven, right? So what happens when you turn on your self-cleaning oven? It leaves a bunch of ash in there, right? So the cerium dioxide can actually be, it can help burn things more efficiently. And so by adding that in, it actually increases the efficiency of use of the diesel fuel. It per amount of diesel fuel used reduces the amount of CO2 that comes out. Okay, so that's a good thing. There are, however, then the concern that, well, what happens to the cerium dioxide? Is this going to be the same issue we had with lead, right? Additives in gasoline. And so, you know, this is one of the reasons that this has been a highly studied material as well.
So is it possible that the impacts of these nanoparticles could be studied in the longer term as a potential effect on evolutionary change? I mean, so as things kind of developed in a primordial soup, what eventually there will be is a kind of different recipe of a primordial soup as all these things are kind of moving around out there, floating around and stuff. And so they wouldn't necessarily have a toxic impact on an organism or an ecosystem, but could conceivably be resources in a sped up kind of accelerated evolutionary scenario?
Well, I'm going to pass the buck here and do an advertisement for next week's, right? My colleague Claudia Gunch is coming, and she's an expert in how microorganisms in particular, but you could kind of think of that as an example, how they adapt to new, in her case, it's usually contaminants, but it could be just new materials in general, right? So there I pass the buck. I mean, come and see her talk. You can ask her that question, and she'll probably give you a better answer than I'm about to give you. But what I will tell you is that we do know that there are generational effects that can occur through, well, I showed you that you have passage of nanomaterials from the mother to the eggs, for example, in that worm. Now, whether or not, so there's an intergenerational potential exchange there. Whether or not that has an impact long term is still, I think those studies still need to be done. Yeah.
So I'm curious, I have a question about risk. You drew the comparison between the way the U.S. makes decisions and the way European nations make decisions. But when we're looking at something like nanotech and we're still pushing the edges of what that means for our society, how do we pick between those two models, and where is their balance? Where is that risk line that we don't want to cross?
Well, I mean, I would tend to be more on the precautionary principle side. I mean, I think if I smell a potential problem, I want to try to avoid that, and then do the work to try to quantify the risks beyond that. So what would make me smell a problem, to use that? I would start with exposure. Okay, I mean, there's kind of two ways. Risk has got two parts, right? I mean, if the risk of a shark, okay, is substantial if you're swimming, I guess, these days on the North Carolina coast, right? I mean, it's getting worse, it sounds like. But so because you have a clear hazard, the hazard of being bitten by a shark, and you have exposure, you're actually in the water where the shark is. So you need both hazard and you need exposure to have risk. If you're sitting on the beach, okay, the hazard is still out there, but you don't have the exposure. You're on the beach. And so the first way to ask yourself whether or not there's potentially a risk associated with material is to say, well, what's the exposure? Do we have substantial exposures? And that's part of the philosophy, which is, people have walked away from that a bit now, and there's just some good reasons for that. But as part of the philosophy that EPA adopted some time ago when they regulate new chemicals, it's based on the quantities that are actually being produced. The idea being that those quantities would make it out in the environment and so on. So yeah, I think the way to kind of get at that would be to look at exposure first, and then there are those that would say, well, let's just look and see if there's any hazard. If you have no hazard, right, then why do you even care about exposure? That becomes kind of a vicious cycle, which one you want to look at first. Sometimes the hazard is easier to evaluate and less contentious, and sometimes it's the other way around.
Thank you, first of all, for the talk tonight. It's been really interesting. So we've talked about application of fish. We've talked about cars, technology. How about humans? So I know there's been some research around nanotechnology, but is there anything that's actually in practice today that's sanctioned by medical bodies in the United States where we're actually using nanotechnology in human beings?
In human beings?
Yeah, for medical treatment or for anything along those lines.
Well, yeah, I mean, one obvious one would be nanosilver in Band-Aids. Okay, so there's a lot of antimicrobial applications of these materials. You might use antimicrobial nanomaterials in catheters or all sorts of devices like that. There's nanomaterials have been used to structure the surfaces of prosthetic devices. It might be a tooth implant. It might be an artificial hip. So, and then, I mean, when we first started looking at this problem, one of the issues was, well, let's look at where some of the materials that nanomaterials are made out of have been used, put in bulk things, so like titanium hips, for example, and look at the wear that occurs and see if there's any toxicity associated with that, and that would be very high concentrations, and there are issues associated with that. There have been modifications to some of those materials over time. There was basically what's called apatite a coating that was put on some dental prosthetic devices that bacteria loved it, and so it turned out to be a bad thing to kind of put in your mouth. So the short answer to your question is yes, there are some things out there, and there are probably even more of those, as I mentioned, in just common consumer products that you'll come in contact with.
So Katie has a question that she's whispering in my ear, which was, how is your knowledge about nanotech and where it is in the world around you and how it interacts with ecosystems change the way you live your life?
It doesn't. No, I mean, it's not keeping me up at night. I would say learning calculus changed my life more. Yeah.
Mine too, but probably not in the same ways that it did yours. Let's give Mark a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Opening up the world. You know, I have to say, that was fantastic. My favorite part, though, was when Mark talked about the way that science sort of got ahead of the curve on this one, right? That instead of waiting for nanotech to be out there and ubiquitous and, oh no, it's a problem, science started at the beginning and has been following it all the way through. And, you know, using things like a precautionary principle or cautionary principle fosters a culture where science is very important, because you need to know what's going to happen in the future if we pursue different paths with science and engineering or different technologies. And I thought that was very inspired. Thank you very much for being here tonight. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I do want to let you know about one more thing. Tomorrow at 11 a.m. in the Daily Planet Theater, so the big Globe Theater, I'm going to do a special show at 11 o'clock. Paul Brinkman, who some of you know he's a Darwin expert, and Darwin's 209th birthday is next Monday, so we're going to celebrate just a few days early. Tomorrow at 11 a.m., if you're interested, join me in the Daily Planet Theater, and Paul's going to do a special talk about Darwin and Darwin's orchids and how Darwin used orchids to meet his contemporaries on sort of level ground. So come out, celebrate Darwin's birthday with us tomorrow at 11 o'clock in the Daily Planet Theater. And I hope we'll see you again also next Thursday for the Science Cafe. Good night, everybody.